Hi, good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Nasher's 360 Speaker Series. I'm Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and today I'm pleased to introduce artist Barry X. Ball. It's not every day that one has the opportunity to speak in the same breath about advanced digital technology, rare Iranian onyx, and martyrs wearing their own skin as a toga. And yet, the Nasher has the good fortune to be opening an exhibition that combines all of this and more through the work of Barry X. Ball. Much of Ball's work operates as a sort of three-dimensional conversation across time, capturing precise likenesses of great historical sculptures and using one artist's finished product as its own jumping-off point. The result is that we now get to spend several months with, say, Michelangelo's final Pietà, layered with Ball's own formal and conceptual innovations. Barry X. Ball describes himself as a devotee of art history, modern Italian design, and California car culture. His work has been featured in solo exhibitions at Ca' Rezzonico in conjunction with the Venice Biennale, MoMA PS1, Site Santa Fe, Magazine 3 Stockholm Kunsthall, Beijing Today Art Museum, Museo di Arte Moderna e Contemporanea di Trento e Rovereto, Museo d'Art Contemporain de Lyon, Via Panza Varese, and Castello Sforesco Milan. I really wish I'd studied Italian, Barry, I'm sorry. It has also been included in important group exhibitions at museums, including the Museum of Arts and Design New York, Bass Museum of Art Miami, and Galerie Nationale de Jeux de Paume Paris. His work is in the collections of numerous institutions, including the Hammer Museum, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Norton Museum of Art, the Fonds Régional d'Art Contemporain Bretagne, Magazine 3 Stockholm Kunsthall, Museo de Arte Moderna e Contemporanea di Trento e Rovereto, and the Panza Collection. Joining Ball in conversation is Nasher Chief Curator Jed Morse, who has been with our institution since its inception and has recently organized major exhibitions focused on Sterling Ruby, Joel Shapiro, Giuseppe Pannone, and Philip Barlow. Following today's talk, I hope you'll all join us for a wine reception just outside on the lower level landing. And now, please join me in welcoming Barry X. Ball and Jed Morse.
Take the outside chair, you can see the... Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, our grand opening day to the public of this extraordinary exhibition of the work of Barry X. Ball. Anna, thank you so much for struggling through all of those institutions. What it did give you a glimpse of is how much Barry's work has been exposed in Europe. In Italy and France in particular. And, as much as Barry has been successful in showing his work in other parts of the world, this is the first major U.S. museum survey of his work, which we are very proud to be bringing to Dallas. It's an exhibition that we've been working on for several years. And it shocked me yesterday when you mentioned the date that we started on this. You said 2012, right?
I think so.
Which is incredible. But, if you go upstairs and you look at the works in the exhibition and you take a look at the dates of those works on the labels, you'll see that these things take a little while to make. And at the time that we started talking to Barry in 2012, he had a lot of really amazing things in the can, ready to go, but not yet produced. And so we wanted to wait until he had some more of those incredible sculptures upstairs already out in the world and ready to go. And I think that sometimes patience is a virtue and it pays off, and it certainly did in this exhibition. So even though this exhibition covers 3 decades, the past 3 decades of Barry's work, with the earliest work dating from 1993, Barry has been a working artist since the late 1970s, early 1980s. And if all you know of Barry's work is what you see upstairs, then you are missing out on what he was doing much earlier. And you may think that these are actually made by two completely different artists and not the same artist. So I wanted to start off with an image of two of Barry's earlier works, clearly working in post-minimalist vocabulary and making things like monochromatic gold ground paintings and then abstract patterned Corian constructions on the right. The gold ground paintings are from the 1980s. This Corian construction is from the early 1990s. And so Barry, I wanted to start off, what's interesting is that even though there may not be clear formal connections between the work that you were doing in the 1980s and early 90s and what we see here today, there's still important conceptual connections. And so how does one get from this work to this work?
Well, when I moved to New York City, it was my first exposure to the great museums of the town, and quickly thereafter, my study of art history visually was augmented by trips to Europe. And I became besotted by the actual objects that I'd seen in darkened art history classrooms in California, Pomona College. LA has pretty decent museums, but not at the level that you find in New York and then in Europe. And the confrontation with those real things influenced me in a way that's continued throughout my 40 plus years as a practicing artist in New York. I'd say that the work that came prior to those in this exhibition was redolent of the past. You can see the sources, but there were not direct quotations from or artworks made in direct response to specific artworks. We start this show with A Profusion of Loss, a work, my first, based on a historical painting, actually, the great lost Battaglia d'Anghiari, the Battle of Anghiari, by Leonardo da Vinci, on the right. In my era, Jansen's art history, which was the compendium that we used, you started the study of the High Renaissance with this image. It was the first reproduction, and was this kind of apotheosis of all things Leonardesque, his genius and incredible swirling mass of battling figures, 11 in total. The crazy thing about this artwork is it's the most famous non-existent artwork in the history of art. It doesn't exist. We only know it through reproductions. Of note here is the Peter Paul Rubens drawing. It was so famous that artists from all over Europe came to Florence and sketched it. Typical of Leonardo, he tried an experimental technique in the Palazzo Vecchio, and it was a disaster, and he abandoned the project. It's also interesting that in that room, the Sala dei Cinquecento, the room of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio, we had the first Battle of the Titans. You had Michelangelo on one wall painting the Battle of Cascina, and Leonardo on the other wall painting the Battle of Anghiari, neither of which got to finish their works. They do not exist. And at the same time, I was thinking about loss, because the great Cimabue crucifix, probably the most famous piece damaged in the 1966 flood in Florence, came to the Metropolitan Museum after almost a 20-year restoration effort, international massive effort to fix this piece. And if you know it in its current state, about 50% of the painted surface is gone. And they've kind of hatched in those missing areas. And my piece, to cut this short, I could go on and on about each of the individual works, is in effect a veneration of the loss in the tradition of icons, putting silver incrustations on top of the painting is a long tradition. The famous Black Madonna of Czestochowa, which was a rallying point during the Solidarity movement in Poland, has almost the entire surface of the painting encrusted with this repoussé filigree. So there's only like the face of the Virgin and the baby Jesus left. And the hatching is a reference to this modern conservation technique where you don't repaint the missing sections like we used to do in the 19th century. You acknowledge the loss. And in effect, the Cimabue crucifix was more powerful in its current damaged state. Its wounds reflect those of Christ on the cross. I was raised as a fundamentalist Christian. I'm not one today, but that was a powerful influence in my life. And, I felt the tragedy of the loss there. And it's been something that's gone through my work in general by making portraits, etc. Right after 9/11 in New York, having my studio have a front row view on the collapse of the towers, etc. So this concept of trying to save important things is it's a running theme.
So let me hop back. And, so there is that you had mentioned this the importance of art history, even in these works, and the references being there. Something else that may not be readily apparent is a dedication to crafting, to craftsmanship. Can you talk a little bit about particularly the gold ground paintings and what you were doing with those monochromatic paintings?
Yeah, I was influenced by Trecento, Quattrocento, early Renaissance, Giotto, Duccio, Cimabue. When I first saw them, I felt of them that they were objects as well as paintings. And the Cimabue crucifix was displayed in the Metropolitan Museum's great medieval hall in the middle of the room so that you could walk around the back and see that it was in effect a sculpture. It had this elaborate cradling system, and I started to play around with that. You can see little parts of the cradling poking out around the side of the golden panel, and eventually, with the works on the right, things leapt off the wall for the first time and got to the middle of the room. And I was talking yesterday, it's ironic because all of my trips to Europe, my long-suffering wife accompanied me as a backpacker, and we always went in the middle of the winter when the rates were cheap and we're freezing in a lot of churches, was that we never looked at sculpture very much. Of course, we saw Michelangelo's David when we were in Florence, but you come to the top of this main entrance stairway at the Uffizi, and you're ready to launch into that great room with the three enthroned Madonnas, Giotto, Cimabue, Duccio, and you look to your right, and there's this really long hallway filled with twisting white forms, and we kind of looked, never walked down there to see the sculpture collection at all. And it was through painting and starting to understand it as an object that I kind of approached sculptures through the back door, and was a big step towards getting where my work is today.
And the black and white Corian piece also required adjustment to using machines to work the Corian, and making, essentially customizing a machine in order to do what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned car culture. I mean, I have a very high opinion of what art was at its best. It was my definition of it is the best thing humans can do. And to me, I I'd seen the obsessiveness that people lavished on cars. I remember reading about the difference between the gaps in the bodies on a Lexus versus an American car of that era. And those kind of things impressed me. I felt like if car makers could go after that, my God, we artists should be also. So when I arrived in New York, I'd had a very good liberal arts undergraduate education at Pomona, but I remember every time I'd ask one of my professors, with a long list, I'd show up of how do you make this, how do you do that, they wisely said, Barry, you'll figure that out. We're going to talk about ideas here. And they probably would have taught me oil painting or etching or ceramics or something that I ultimately wouldn't have used. So good, we didn't waste a lot of time on that. But I considered coming to New York like I'm in the Olympics now, and I got to get my chops together. A little bit like classical pianists. My children had a very rigid Russian teacher, and she basically said, you give me 10 years and you can begin to think about having an idea. And I felt the same way, so I bought every back issue of Fine Woodworking magazine, all of the Tage Frid, Bruce Hoadley books, Ralph Mayer's book of art technology, read them, saved my money to buy a table saw, trained myself to be a cabinet maker as the basis of all of my skills, then started building machines. I bought a vintage Bridgeport milling machine, added 4-axis digital readout and power feeds, and was almost a precursor of CNC technology, and just tried to see what level I could get to. I felt like there should be no limits, and that's continued to this day. It's my job to raise the money, to have the time to bring my sculptures up to a fever pitch level of execution. I feel like they have a vibration, a buzz. They're not like other objects you see in the world. They should be special and not have expediency as the first thing you think about. They should be something that was done to the max. And so I've kind of always had that philosophy in making my work.
And that's where this kind of scream expression comes from, or symbolizes, in a sense. You refer to it as, the kind of high pitch intensity that you try to bring to your work. And the other thing, of course, is that this change, obviously, from a kind of a highly abstract post-minimalist vocabulary, and then turning to essentially the most ancient form of sculpture making, stone portraiture. Why turn to the figure, particularly in the late 1990s?
When I was making the black and white sculptures, in the process of making one, the way this really long cylindrical cutter bit into the block when I was milling it, I suddenly saw the lines dip and curve, almost like a Bridget Riley op painting. And I'm thinking, why are we always dealing with straight lines and cubes and rectangles? What would be the ultimate curved surface? And then I thought, well, it's the human head. Also, what would be the most difficult possible thing for me to do? And I set about pursuing that. Actually, the screaming self-portrait that is flanking on the two figures here, was one of my earliest attempts to try to approach figurative art through the new technology available to us in hopes that I would achieve different results. I wasn't trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition as a traditional figurative artist. We didn't have anatomy classes, etc. But I thought that I could get some portraiture realized in some new way by having new technology. So I went to Los Angeles. At that time, the only scanners available, 3D scanners, were either for the military or for Hollywood. And the place I went had recently scanned Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger, other action stars. You could see their busts around the room as a step towards special effects in the movies. And I wanted to immediately make something really intense, so I sat in this chair with the 18-second cycle of scanning and screamed my head off through multiple tries trying to get it right, but weird for me, probably normal for actors. That screaming self-portrait has become something that we've used, I think, in 5 works throughout the exhibition, almost like I'm letting everything hang out. In this case, Matthew Barney, my main subject, is very becalmed, and I'm losing it. That started me down the road toward portraiture. How did stone enter the picture? Very quickly after these, I heard of a place called the Johnson Atelier. It was in Trenton, New Jersey, 70 miles south of New York City. And it was funded by J. Seward Johnson, an heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune. So he was your basic billionaire artist guy. He had established this facility that became the leading fabrication facility in the United States for art. It had 100+ employees, primarily doing bronze casting. He was convinced by this guy who became my friend, Walter Duesenberry, an older artist, to build a state-of-the-art stone fabrication facility. And they, without any projects in mind, without any of the normal economic considerations that going into buying these multi-$100,000 machines, bought a complete suite of CNC equipment in a giant 20,000 square foot building with 50-foot ceilings, bridge cranes, all the highest tech toys to play with to make stone sculpture, but they hadn't figured out how to do it yet. And I came along thinking that they had digital capabilities, and they happened to be harnessed to the making of stone sculptures. And Walter encouraged me to try. He actually went away on vacation. I remember I was left alone with the equipment and 1 or 2 technicians. And we made a portrait group of Dr. Ponza, Count Ponza from Varese, Italy, a great supporter of me from the 90s. And I started playing directly with the machines. And the first ones are white marble, Greek marble. And then I discovered the panoply of stone types available and wondered why artists hadn't really mined that vein. There are instances of polychrome sculpture utilizing different stones, Egyptian art, yellow jasper, some Roman portraits you'll see in the Capitol and museums with marble heads and togas of onyx, etc. But in general, we think of sculpture as white marble. And my first trip to the Tuscan coast, the Carrara Versilia region, 30 miles of stacked stone blocks on an industrial scale in like this Pantone range of colors, the best Brazilian stone, the best Iranian, Portuguese, American, Egyptian, Bolivian, all out there. And I just saw that this could add an incredible expressive level to my work. And I've been pretty engaged, consumed by that, working back and forth with the material and the forms of my sculpture ever since.
So one of the interesting themes that comes up in your work, and I think it's pretty visible throughout the exhibition, is this notion of duality. This is a dual portrait of you and Matthew Barney. And the themes of doubling, duality, mirroring are things that happen throughout your work, sometimes overtly, as in this case, sometimes more subtly. And I'm curious if that first, what was the impact of that first encounter with a scan of your own head? Did that have some kind of impact in terms of how you saw the potential metaphorical resonances of doing portrait sculpture?
Well, yeah, some of the greatest works by painters like Rembrandt are his self-portraits. I set up an elaborate mirror array in the basement of my studio so I could, for the first time in my life, look at the back and side of my head. And I was kind of shocked that the milled head that came out of that scanning session, it was this weird asymmetrical blobby thing. I mean, I'd shaved my head to go out there, which was weird to begin with, but when you finally are confronted with it, it was just almost like standing back outside your body and examining this thing that wasn't me. And I started on the same analytical path that I've used throughout my work, just treating it, like I said, like the most incredible curved surface in the world, and something that we all, from the minute we're born to the day we die, study, is looking at other people around us. It just, I mean, I started studying eyes, how to treat them. The great 19th century portraitist Houdon, famous for the portraits of the American revolutionary heroes like Thomas Jefferson, and then the French Voltaire, Rousseau, etc., had these most incredible eyes with the iris carved delicately incised with the, quote, spark of life, a little rectangle dangling from the upper lid. And I ultimately came up with my own eye, which is a polished orb that would reflect the light, and you'll see that throughout several of the portraits here. I know, I just got down to the business of treating my head like just another object and analyzing what in the hell to do with it. So.
We talked about that one, and so you may be wondering why include this thing in an exhibition that otherwise is entirely figurative stone sculpture. And the reason is that I think it shows not only the connection to the previous work, but then the extension to the Masterpieces series, where there is this incredibly deep consideration of a work of art by an important predecessor. In this case, the missing fresco by Leonardo, which again was an important work for many artists, including Peter Paul Rubens, who did this extraordinary drawing, and a number of artists who have copied that drawing over and over again because it is such a radical and dynamic composition. But it's that incredibly careful looking, and the tradition of thinking very deeply about what artists of the past have done and incorporating that into your own work that really stands at the center of the Masterpieces series. And I thought, I thought we would talk a little bit about the Sleeping Hermaphrodite, because not only does it have an extraordinary history that that extends from a lot of the same interests that you found in the Battle of Anghiari and A Profusion of Loss, but it also is a literal embodiment of duality, which also must have been a kind of irresistible, an irresistible metaphor to engage with. And then also we've got some wonderful images about that illustrate your process. So I wonder if we can kind of try and wrap our arms around all of those various elements that go into the Sleeping Hermaphrodite.
I'll try.
Okay.
Working after another artist's work is a long tradition. Also in Jansen's art history, you had Mantegna and Dürer and their interaction, etc. Here in Texas at the Kimball in Fort Worth, you have maybe Michelangelo's earliest work when he was 12. It's the Temptation of St. Anthony painting that he did after Martin Schongauer's etching. It's new. It's definitely not Martin Schongauer's work in a copy. From the minute he touched brush to canvas, he was, or panel in this case, he was interpreting. I'd contrast it a bit with the digital scanning. Something I liked about it is that it's cold data. Unlike the people sketching in the Musée du Louvre or the Metropolitan, there is no interpretation. We're just gathering the facts. And I brought the facts back to my studio after this elaborate digital scanning process and felt like I was seeing it in a way, the sculptures in a way that the original artist never had been able to, from above, below, inside, etc. And the first process is just analysis of what we have here. What could I enhance? What could I change? To hold on to all the power of the originals, but take them to a new place. So at the end, they are new works. I had the opportunity in Europe several times to show my works next to their historical antecedents. First exhibition of my Sleeping Hermaphrodite, I did another version in Belgian black marble, was in the Cour Carrée of the Louvre, right outside the windows where the sculpture that I scanned lies, in the Salle de Caryatide. Here we are, scanning in that room. Another thing that comes to mind is I had an art history professor, Gerald Ackerman. He's conservative because he wrote the catalogue raisonné of Gérôme. I don't know if you know this artist. He's like the evil counterpart to the Impressionists, but a very competent technician. And Mr. Ackerman was an incredibly emotional professor that I owe a lot to. He regularly wept in class. The guy'd seen that same image of Raphael 500 times, and it comes up on screen again. The guy started breaking down in tears. This is the kind of guy you want as your professor. And he told me about the Sleeping Hermaphrodite, the class, about it. One of the versions of the original Roman copies that were made after 2nd century BC Greek bronzes is in a small private museum in Rome, and that they always face it toward the wall. So the surprise factor, the crying game factor, is always off of the main axis of passage throughout the museum. And when I was in the Louvre scanning, this was beautiful because we got to do this on the day the Louvre is closed. And Gerald Ackerman had died by this time. And the whole time I'm thinking, I wish he was there. Because beautifully quiet, giant room filled with these masterpieces. And there was one student out there in that darkened room who, wasn't asleep and really caught the fire that that I felt from him. And I'm working with this piece that he had first told me about. And then the scanning went on to the next day, and we had to cordon it off, and the audio guides bring the groups through the museum. And there was a group of Asian schoolgirls, I remember, like big, and they're all listening dutifully, and then it directs them to go around the backside, and there was like all this pointing and tittering at the penis on the other side. So it's pretty funny.
So you bring up your experience as an undergraduate in art history class and how affecting that was, and it reminds me of the anecdote that you had talked about in other interviews about an assignment of going into one of the museums in Los Angeles.
It was LACMA.
So yeah, having an assignment to go to LACMA, choose a work of art, and write an essay about that work of art. And I think you chose a Picasso Cubist still life. And rather than write an art historical essay about that work of art, you sketched it in minute detail down to the bits of dirt that were on the painted surface, the stray hairs of the canvas, and taking notes all along the way. So not just reprising what was there, but looking extraordinarily carefully at that painting as a physical object, as well as a representation of an art historical moment. And every time we look at the masterpieces, I think about you as a young student kind of reveling in that work by Picasso. Was it the same professor? Was it Professor Ackerman, or was it a different professor?
No, it's another one from Scripps College. We were allowed to cross-register, but Arthur Stevens sent us there. But it was. I hadn't seen that many real paintings by Picasso in my life, so it kind of was a precursor of just the facts, ma'am. I want to see what's there, So I remember I thought I was going to get into art historically interpreting this thing philosophically, but it took me like 3 or 4 hours, and that was my designated time, and I had arrows and the drawing, and I ended up just handing in that, and he was very positive. I mean, I had a lot of professors who encouraged my individualistic bent. Thank God.
So, this kind of craving to start with just the facts, just the data of the object. What happens at that point once you've captured that? The other thing actually that this is reminding me of is that this connection to existing works of art and also the profusion of loss reminds us of this, mourning the loss of things. An important thing to point out, I think, is that in digitally scanning these objects, not only do you get a more precise three-dimensional picture of that object than you could ever get take as many photographs with a camera as you want, and you'll never get as precise a three-dimensional view of that object as you can with a digital scanner. And that doing that is incredibly important for institutions like the Louvre that own these things and are charged with preserving them. We've scanned sculptures in the Nasher collection for just that reason, because you have an extraordinarily precise document of the physical condition of that object that you can then rely on should, God forbid, anything ever happen to it. And so that scanning process that you do is incredibly valuable for the works of art that you end up scanning. So that's one element of the scanning process is the preservation aspect. And then the other aspect is it then provides you with a jumping off point to reconsider that object. Can you take us through what happens after the scan?
Sure. We've got the sleeping hermaphrodite up here. Do we have images of the? Yeah. Okay. This will.
It's a kind of a bigger jump, but at least it gives you.
Yeah.
Something.
That's actually not as precise as the scan really is, but on the left you'll see, like in the left arm, digs and chips and so on. So there's a lot of historical damage. The original is actually a mosaic. The pillow is separate, the bed is separate, the drapery is separate. This is the most famous composite artwork in the history of art. Effectively, multiple artists have been working on it over 2 millennia, and my idea was to do a 21st century consolidation, a monolith. John Lorenzo Bernini, the young house genius was working for Cardinal Scipione Borghese of the Borghese Garden and Villa in Rome, and was given the sleeping hermaphrodite that they had unearthed near the baths of Diocletian recently, been buried for 1,500 years. And it was, he effectively gave an artwork to a contemporary artist and said, do something with it. And Bernini actually upped the kind of sexuality of the work by bedding it. There are other versions of the sleeping hermaphrodite on flat slabs. So Bernini couldn't alter the hermaphrodite. He couldn't make the drapery bend to fit the bed. It's stone. But he did a pretty admirable job of carving the mattress and kind of insetting it. But you kind of see it's kind of an oval of stone kind of cut into the mattress. So one thing I did alteration-wise is immediately mirror it. My version upstairs is a mirror image. She's twisting the other way. The other thing I did was repair the historical damage. Except for the hands, I wanted to leave this kind of vestigial wound. It's also a little bit of a Duchampian joke. Art is in the head, not the hand, except in my work, there's a hell of a lot of hand work. The drapery, too, we completely remodeled to make it subtly conform to the tufted bed. We digitally recreated the bed to make it more perfect and then reprojected the detail onto it. In the final sculpture, we carved the backside of the face, which the Romans didn't do. It was like carving a ship in a bottle with mirrors on the, and subtle alterations to make the thing more lifelike, more sexy, and I don't know if we have anybody under 18 here. I have one funny story. So I went to Greenwich Village's most well-known sex shop, a huge place, and was searching for a better model of the male member. And so I had a very helpful saleswoman come up, and I explained that I was making this sleeping hermaphrodite sculpture. I kind of went on length, and can you show me what you've got? And she brought them out, and there was a long array of like 20 in various sizes and textures and materials. And I said, okay, give me a few minutes. I'm going to make my choice. I come up to the counter, and she rings it up, and she goes, would you like lube with that? But we did change the male member, and that was also kind of funny because we sent it to a separate scanning company in Baltimore, and it took a while for the scan to come back, and I called I know the woman at the desk, and I go, you know that thing I sent down, has it been scanned? She goes, oh, you mean the object. And so that was the name it had at the scanning company. But we basically, I took away the classical micro penis and put a more realistically sized one.
So you had mentioned that the image on the left is kind of is the scan of the work at the Louvre, and the one on the right is a 3D printed model based on your alterations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we use the 3D printed models. Actually, in this exhibition, there were some 3D printed works, both a model, the portrait of John Paul II in the large gallery, and the small dual portrait of Matthew Barney and me. So we're actually creating works directly from 3D printing. Yeah. In general, they are our models. We have a complete digital workflow now. I have a lot of people on staff who are highly skilled, have master's degree, were trained at the New York Academy of Art, several of them, which has a kind of classical Beaux-Arts-like education, with the graduation exercise being creation of an écorché flayed figure displaying their mastery of musculature and bone structure. I eventually developed those skills too, but we've discovered that the computer, digital modeling, CNC milling, all of those processes are just much more flexible, and have pretty much abandoned conventional plaster and clay modeling. And we sculpt directly in the computer, but we produce the 3D models as references, both to confirm what we see on screen, and second of all, as a reference out in the carving shop itself for all of the work that we need to do to get the parts the machine missed.
Yeah. So I think whenever we've talked about this, this weekend, I don't know that you've accurate. Well, I wouldn't say accurate. I don't know that you've really given people a sense of the CNC milling process, because it's not just transferring a computer file to the CNC milling machine and the milling machine just goes to town. I mean, this is a process that's actually very complex and takes, for a sculpture this large, months for the machine to actually get the rough cut.
Yeah.
And the images that you see here are various stages of the CNC milling machine doing the initial rough cut for that beautiful pink onyx sleeping hermaphrodite that's upstairs. Can you tell us a little bit about this process and what goes into it?
Yeah, this is a large gantry style mill. In the world of CNC machines, there are these that have giant rigid walls, and in machine language we call them axes. There are only 3 in Cartesian space, up, sideways, and back. But here, this is a 7-axis machine. You call this one axis. You call this another axis. You call this another axis, etc. And we start out with a block. Often now I will scan the block and have a digital image of it and move the digital sculpture inside the block, something that Michelangelo and Bernini would have loved to have had in their toolkit. And we basically get down to the final surface through a progressively finer cutter. You start out with large ones to remove lots of material. And then it's water cooled, water lubricated, and water dust control. The water's filtered and reused again. And you slowly mill away. You vaporize the stone here and turn it into dust. All that valuable Iranian onyx, half of it or 2/3 of it are turned to dust. And I ultimately not only use this to rough the figure out, but to work directly with the milling path. In this case, if you look at the final sculpture, it has a kind of corduroy texture on the bed to differentiate it from the drapery, which has a matte texture, and then the body is mirror polished. We specify that microfluted ribbing on the mattress, the direction of it, and so on, and that is really time consuming. The cutter is moving glacially, an inch an hour kind of thing, so as not to chip the surface. And this goes on for months. Like Jed said, I think the St. Bartholomew flayed upstairs was on the robot continuously 24/7 for about 8 months. This one, more or less the same. Multiple programs have to be written with a repositioning of the head to get into the undercuts. At the end, it doesn't get all of them. The work upstairs had subsequent to this, and this came after all the digital modeling, etc. Subsequent to the CNC milling, over 10,000 hours of handwork. went into that sculpture.
And here's a photo of some of the team. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 around it right now. And then you can see above it is hanging the 3D printed model that serves as their detailing guide.
Yeah, this is in the old studio. Part of the reason we waited so long to build this show was I needed to concurrently build a state-of-the-art 20,000 square foot studio in New York that would enable me to realize some of the works that literally could not have been made in the old studio. My guys here, actually, that's Hina to the right, a woman is the head of my hand carving team now. They're working in a Home Depot shed that was in the backyard of my little studio. And there you can kind of see the sheds. It was like child abuse putting them in there, but they were never complaining. We had heat, compressed air to power our equipment, and air conditioning in those little sheds. But that was the largest piece we could possibly have done in the old studio because it's horizontal. On the right, you can kind of just see one little view of the new studio. That's a 25-foot tall room that St. Bartholomew is standing in with 20-ton bridge cranes, et cetera, and my stone collection out beyond the windows. And, it's an incredible place that I built partly to make up for all of the torture I'd put these guys through. So we had one bathroom and kind of a half kitchen. We have 9 bathrooms and 3 kitchens now. So it's, they deserve it because they kill themselves. I think we have a wonderful atmosphere at the studio. People believe that what we're doing is important. There's not cynicism, and I wish all of them could have been here. I'm thinking about bringing them all down to Dallas to have the celebratory, experience of actually viewing the sculpture. St. Bartholomew, we finished and immediately locked it in the crate and shipped it to Dallas. That piece is a little over 2 weeks old out in the lobby, this work. So, and we had 9 people at a time for the last couple months on 2 levels on scaffolds, working in shifts from about 8 a.m. to midnight. I had 7 people on Thanksgiving Day, 7 people on Thanksgiving Friday, and like 8 people on Christmas Day working on this sculpture to detail and finish it.
Let's go through a couple of things really quickly. I wanted to go back to NV Purity, because we have 2 versions of NV Purity on view here. There's this one, which is the black Portoro marble NV and the white Iranian onyx Purity. And then right across the gallery from it here, and there's an image of Barry's NV Purity, which derived from different sculptures by 2 completely different artists. So, these compositions were never meant to be put together, but Barry has combined them as a poignant pair. But just so you can see some of the changes that Barry instituted in making these things. But one of the reasons why we have 2 versions of this is that I think not only does it extend this notion of doubling and duality and multiples, but also it really illustrates the expressive potential that you are eliciting from stone, using the material to create potentially wildly different readings of those pairs, just through changing the material. I wonder if you can talk a bit about, that the shift that happens when you do that, because you've made these objects individually in different kinds of stone, and then as pairs in different kinds of stone. And what does it mean for you to shift from the black and white NV Purity to the Pakistani and Wounded Mexican Onyx NV Purity?
Yeah, if you can flip back to the black and white pair.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're thinking of an ideal stone for purity on the right, the translucent, milky white Iranian onyx seems right. And in this case, I wanted to kind of link them with the white of this sculpture showing up as the Venetian in the classic Italian Portoro marble of the envy. I've always tended to choose a tortured stone for envy and a more sedate, perfect, beautiful, pristine for purity. If we go now to the next one,
That one.
I proved a negative. I decided what would happen if we tried doing something violent with the purity. I mean, I actually concurrently been reading in the news about these horrific acid attacks in places like India and Afghanistan on women, and I thought I could use this Mexican onyx, which is my favorite stone, a stone that I obtained through staging expeditions to Baja California. Use the expressive figure, color, holes, and give it a whole different reading. I mean, it's what artists do. If there's a rule, you break it. And whereas in this case, I stayed with a fairly effusive, layered, multicolored stone for the envy on the left. It's just a classic example of almost trying to be painterly and match the red in the left and have it come out in the red runes on the right against the beautiful travertine walls here at the Nasher. I think it's particularly effective. So.
And then what happens, of course, when you scan these things and you make changes to them is that you're very directly having a conversation with that object and with the artist that had created the object that you scanned. And one of the artists that you seem to want to have conversations with over and over again is Michelangelo. You had an opportunity to scan his last great unfinished work, the Pietá Rondanini, that he died working on at the age of 88, never finished. And you've taken it, and the kinds of changes that you've made are extremely subtle, particularly for someone who doesn't necessarily know the original work. But they're incredibly poignant changes. Can you talk a little bit about say the two main changes that because you made lots of other formal changes, but the two main changes that really affect how one reads the object?
Yeah, sorry if any of you were on the tours and I'm repeating some, but it bears repeating. This is an extraordinary work of Michelangelo's, which was ignored. It was in the inventory of his possessions when he died and was thought to be nothing. The work came to the Rondanini family, and their palazzo in Rome was stored outdoors in the courtyard for a couple hundred years. As late as the 20th century, there are pictures of the Rondanini family kids playing with their cars on the sculpture. And they plopped it on this ill-suited Roman grave stela just because they were like a lot of these Roman families, they had it sitting around. In this view, you don't notice it, but front to back, it's way too narrow, and Michelangelo's actually overhanging the base. And so there's an interesting link to something else in our exhibition. At the end of World War II, the citizens of Milano started a campaign to raise money to bring the Pietà Rondanini from Rome to Milan as a kind of symbol of the resurgence of the town from the ashes of the war. And one of the guys who led that campaign was the great Italian modernist collector Gianni Mattioli. Has maybe the finest collection of futurism, etc. And his daughter, Laura Mattioli, is the subject of one of my portraits out here. She is the biggest lender to this exhibition. And she assisted me with getting access to the Michelangelo work to scan it in Castello Sforzesco. So they brought it to Milano. They realized this base didn't fit. They proposed several alternatives, and they all got rejected. Everybody wanted to stick with the original because it kind of had a history with that pedestal. And that's how it was shown in Castello Sforzesco for almost 50 years, or over 50 years. And I scanned it in this position. They'd made this elaborate architectural niche for it in the Ancient Art Museum there in the middle of this giant castle in the middle of Milano. And I didn't realize when I scanned it that they were thinking of creating an entire museum called the Museo Pietà Rondanini specifically for it in the castle grounds. Turns out they used my scan to make a rough copy of the sculpture and did all this seismic testing with it. There's pictures of the rough copy in a lab, but with all these guys with lab coats examining how it moves. And they ended up making a vibration-resistant base for it, all using my scan data, which was perfect for me because I always pay for the scanning and hoping that, it, like Jed said, that it would be available for restorers or studiers of the work. And in exchange, I get to use the scan data to make art. And I think more and more in Europe and around the world, they think of me as a serious guy. I'm not going to make trinkets and sell them in the museum shop. I'm going to do something, important with it. And in this case, it was like a perfect circle. They ended up working with my scan data to make a new installation of the work. And I had the pleasure of showing mine in the position of the original one in the castle with the Michelangelo very nearby in its new place. The changes that I made, though, were first I took that base and turned it into a trapezoidal solid and made it fit. If you stand in front of the entire 10-foot tall structure in the Nasher here, you'll see that it's kind of a long obelisk-like form now. But I kept the pedestal. The new installation, by the way, of Michelangelo, they took the pedestal away. They show it off to the side, and it's on this cylindrical, kind of anonymous base. I thought it fit because it's a grave still. It's a man and woman united in this sculpture. That's Hades down below, crossing the river Styx. It would link the ancient world to the world of the Renaissance, the pagan world to Christianity. And on the sculpture, the late great art historian, the University of Pennsylvania, Leo Steinberg, postulated that this Pietà was unlike all the others. It was not a mother holding the dead body of her son. It was as if the son was supporting his mother in her grief, almost carrying her on his back. And so you can kind of see here on the right in the Michelangelo, she's standing on a block of stone. I took it away and let her foot droop down to kind of emphasize that. It also kind of helped with the beautiful side arc of the composition. And the other big formal change was I took the roughed out face of Christ and replaced it with a portrait of Michelangelo himself. This is a guy who was carving his own funeral monument, whether he knew it or not. That's 5-6 days before he died. And we scanned the portrait of Michelangelo by his student Daniele da Volterra, the infamous Daniele da Volterra, known as the guy who painted the fig leaves on all the figures in the Sistine Chapel on command of the Catholic Church. But he also did the one famous portrait we have. There's a copy in the Louvre, and there was one in Castello Sforzesco, and we digitally morphed it into this piece. So it's Michelangelo holding up the Virgin. I don't know if you know, at the end of his life, he was really dedicated to the Virgin. He was dedicated to the church. He became very spiritual. He donated all of his work on the design of St. Peter's, etc. And in this work in general, you see an old man on the fly, going down fighting, inventing a new form of sculpture. This is not the muscular Michelangelo that we know of the figures of the Sistine Chapel, firmly rooted on the ground. These are ethereal, elongated, mannerist, like El Greco, Pontormo, Bronzino, spiritual, neo-Gothic almost figures, weightless, and he did this, like I said, on the fly. He left the arm from an earlier, more broad composition, and when he was attenuating and stretching the figures, he probably, he wasn't done. And there's almost a catalog of stoneworking in this one piece, from pure raw stone at the back to very large, rough chisel works. Chisel marks and finer, and then polished parts. You don't polish until you're done with a sculpture. It's almost as if that question of, is the famous non finito of Michelangelo intentional, or did he just not get done? In this case, it is like it was arrested creation, which makes it especially poignant as a work. And one more thing you'll notice out there, those rough chisel marks of Michelangelo are crossed by my marks. I kept the robot milling lines fairly broad in this work, and they're a long horizontal spiral that goes from the bottom of the pedestal all the way to the top of the head, so that you can see mine and Michelangelo's marks superimposed. And they also add what Leonardo called a sfumato, a smoky texture to the work that works in concert with the translucent stone that I hope, with the beautiful light that we have here in the Nasher, to give it a kind of translucent inner light, a radiance. And the block of, by the way, this piece of Iranian onyx is extraordinary. I go to Italy a couple times, 5 or 6 times a year, once every couple months, and you can look and look and look to find a piece of white Iranian onyx this large for years, and was lucky enough to have it pointed out to me. I ran over immediately and looked at it, and was verified later by some other stone friends of mine as just an absolutely unique piece of stone, large enough to realize this work for here. So.
And then let's talk a little bit about our friend Saint Bart. This is the most recent work. You mentioned it was finished a few hours before it was crated and put in a truck to be brought down to Dallas. People working, till the wee hours of the morning on Thanksgiving, Christmas even, and the figure of Saint Bart, I thought, was an interesting selection because, you were talking about the écorché, and that being the kind of final test for graduates of the National Academy program, which is a very traditional training program. And, this hails from a time at which there was as much interest in the kind of spiritual ramifications of Saint Bartholomew and his adherence to his faith as there was to the kind of physical portrayal of the musculature underneath the skin. And I'm curious about, if the selection of the theme of Saint Bartholomew, resonated with you in terms of having done all of these years of stone carving. Is Saint Bartholomew in a way a kind of patron saint of what it is that you and your team do?
Well, it seems like in that period where we get all the saints from the period of early Christianity, there was almost a competition to come up with the most extreme way to kill somebody. And probably right up high on the list is being flayed alive. I came upon the historical antecedent of this for the first time in 2011. It's in the Duomo in Milano, Italy. It's on a tall pedestal up against a column of the church. As I saw it from a long way away, it's the fourth largest cathedral in the world. And I thought it was a Roman guy wearing a toga. And you get up closer and there's, again, this extreme factor with the skin of his head thrown over his shoulder. I substituted, again, me screaming instead of the original face. And I think it's symbolic of the extreme nature of my pursuit of, I hope, excellence. And the material has never been used, as far as I know, for a sculpture. It's quite difficult. It's French Rouge du Roi, King's Red marble from Languedoc, southern France. It's used decoratively at even Versailles. I just saw the floors in the Frick collection in New York have some of this marble. But it has a bloody USDA choice marbling too, which seemed appropriate. I could talk on and on about this, but there's an interesting connection again to Michelangelo in that, and this and the Pietà next door. And I'll try to make this quick. The one time Michelangelo signed his work was the first Pietà in Rome, the famous one. And there's a banner across the chest which says in Latin, Michelangelo of Florentine made this. In this work, in the Duomo of Milano, down below on that ribbon, which I purposely kept blank here, it says in Latin, this is not by Praxiteles, the great Greek sculptor. This is by Marco de Grati. He was very proud. He's basically saying, it's not by that Greek guy, it's by me, Mark. And so he was apparently cognizant of a lost écorché figure by Michelangelo, which we know from the background of a few paintings. It was less than life-size, but apparently was extremely influential. You have to realize that Michelangelo and Leonardo did their dissections in secret, aided by a couple priests, apocryphally. And by the time we get to the 16th century, we have Vesalius's treatise, the first serious attempt at an anatomical book. And it came out about the time of this. The Michelangelo sash with the signature is suspiciously similar to Marco de Grati's signature across the bottom of this. So he was obviously aware of the great Florentine artist who lived up till 1564, until the Mannerist period, when this work was made. Marco de Grati, as far as we know, didn't make any other memorable signed works. He worked for the Duomo his whole life as a stonemason, but he kind of got his one opportunity and went for it. And then to complete the Michelangelo connection, the only self-portrait of Michelangelo is as the skin of Saint Bartholomew in the Sistine Chapel on the end wall in the Last Judgment. Saint Bartholomew is holding up a swag of skin, and in it is the stretched face of Michelangelo. Damien Hirst did one based on an anatomical model. I think it's been a favorite subject for artists It's bizarre. The guy is very becalmed and standing there in a classic contrapposto pose while he's got his skin ripped off of him.
The kind of extension that is highlighted, extension of the Masterpieces series that's highlighted upstairs is the Medardo Rosso project, which is a pretty large scale project on its own, but one that, this was something that you were just starting to embark on when we first started talking about this exhibition. And since the Nasher collection has one of the largest and most important collections of Medardo Rosso in the world, we thought, wow, this is a really great, a great connection with our own collection. We'd like to wait until, you've got some of the Medardo Rosso project works under your belt. And so what you see here are 3 works by Barry X. Ball that are based on Medardo Rosso's that he scanned in collections in Italy, but that correspond with works by Medardo Rosso in the Nasher sculpture collection. So there's the Concierge or Door Woman on the left, Ecce Puer in the middle, and the Sick Child on the right. One of the things that I find fascinating, it makes complete sense that you would, want to engage with Medardo Rosso's work in the way that you do, because, Rosso was such an experimental artist at the end of the 19th century, doing things with, with traditional sculptural techniques that no one was attempting, no one was doing. Taking the lost wax casting method, arresting it in the middle of it, saving the wax shell, which is supposed to be melted out and replaced by bronze, and using that very ephemeral, translucent material as the finished product and reinforcing it with plaster. But not only that, but then doing this over and over and over again, repeating the compositions that he had made earlier in his career, making slight adjustments to them, each time. So very carefully kind of reconsidering his own output. That kind of sense of experimenting with existing processes to come up with new things and constantly reconsidering something that already exists is something that's apparent in the masterpieces. One of the things that comes out in your work, of course, is the translucency of Medardo Rosso's work is multiplied exponentially by the translucency of the stone. And I wonder if you can talk about your particular interest in Rosso's work and what you're trying to emphasize in your reimaginings of those.
Well, the bulk of the works in the exhibition have very defined, recognizable forms of humans and portraits, so on. So I was attracted to the abstraction of his work and wanted to try to push it to the point of almost pure abstraction, unrecognizability. I love the translucent stones because they seem to generate an inner light. And yes, in particular, the baby at the breast and the golden honeycomb calcite to me is a direct reference to the golden wax on the Medardo Rossos. I talked to Jed when I first visited Dallas, and you had some of the Rosso works out about wanting to do something in response to those as kind of a core of our exhibition. And I never scanned the works here, but I, through my Italian friends in Italy, was able to scan almost the catalogue raisonné of Rosso's work, 39 of them actually, in multiple museums in Italy. And I also worked with my friend Laura Mattioli at her Center for Italian Modern Art in New York to stage an exhibition of Rosso's work about 6 years ago. I designed the pedestals for that exhibition and did the lighting, was in intimate contact with the works, and just started to think that this guy was a great artist, overlooked. The Italians will say that the French wrote the history of modern art, and somehow we know Rodin when actually the precursor Rosso really had a lot of the ideas that then Rodin capitalized on. In photography and drawing, this guy made beautiful works and also was ahead of Brancusi, etc. He had the misfortune to only be able to make small works. And if you want to be remembered in the history of art, if you only make intimate scaled things, you sometimes get overshadowed by the monument makers. But he's become a favorite in the contemporary art world now. Contemporary art galleries are showing Medardo Rosso. My colleagues are all besotted by this guy. And I wanted to do something that I've done with many of my works, is to flip the classic divide between additive and reductive sculpture. With this work, Rosso's works were all created additively, built up out of plaster, wax, etc. And my works are created reductively, a la Michelangelo, starting with a block and cutting down to the form. And I have eventual plans to realize the full catalog raisonné of these works. I think the way that they work here in space is beautiful. Looks a little bit like a museum of natural history exhibition of minerals. And again, trying to work very hard to have the individual characteristics of the stone operate in concert with the forms. This one is one of my favorites in that it's almost a purely abstract mound of Mexican onyx from Baja California. And it's a good example of what I'm going to be capable of in my new studio, because in the process of making this, instead of making the hollowed out back that I originally intended, which kind of echoes more what Medardo Rosso had done, I decided to extend the figure to the original back crust's beautiful red surface of the stone. And in the entire figure, the only really recognizable figurative element is the little face of the baby. This is Baby at the Soup Kitchen, in Italian, Bambina alla cucina economica. And it relates this work, which I like, to the two scholars' rocks in the exhibition. If you know anything, or if you don't know about the Chinese tradition of scholars' rocks, it was a long tradition, almost an act of pure connoisseurship, where they would select a naturally formed piece of rock, often from rivers that had lots of erosion and holes and so on, and simply take what God had created and recontextualize, put it on a wooden base, and they would contemplate it in the way that we look at clouds and find figures in it, etc. And to me, it was like a natural counterpart to a Duchampian gesture, which is to take an industrially made object and recontextualize it just by moving the snow shovel or the urinal into a gallery and putting it on a pedestal. We look at it in a complete new way. And I always am examining why I'm using stone. It's not reflexive for me. I think I told you about it. It came late in the process of analysis in my work. And so the idea of, also the perverse idea of carving a rock out of a rock was interesting to me. So the two here are the same form. Interesting that it's based on a fake. There was a kind of parallel tradition of taking the most beautiful scholars' rocks and trying to copy them. I bought one to my son's great consternation. He was trying to drag me away from an antique dealer on 2nd Avenue, New York. And it was a complete fake, had been created by drilling, etc. And I liked that was starting with that. And then the one on the right is actually a 3.5 times stretched version of the one on the left. So the left is Mexican onyx, the right a beautiful piece. If you see it in the exhibition, the back side of the stone is completely white, and the lower part is Belgian black marble.
So I wanted to finish up by taking a look at the Pope, which it really offers a new way of composing, a new way of making in your work, and it's also an element that I've struggled to try and come up with predecessors in art history for this kind of work, the kind of composite portrait. You can think of in painting Archimboldo, doing still lifes of fruits and vegetables and things that looked like faces. But this is something completely different. I mean, this is taking elements of a subject's life and incorporating them in an unbelievably complex interior-exterior form that summarizes that subject's life. And just the fact of, because it is such an amazingly complex interior-exterior form, how on earth does one make that thing? Which you've been working on.
I've been struggling with that. We were supposed to have the real one, which is going to be realized in about 175 pounds of solid silver, plated in rhodium and palladium. And it's been a multi-year project with many technical hurdles to overcome. It seems like we're on a pretty linear path to the finish line, but there's a tremendous amount of work remaining. I'm working with the renowned Italian jewelers Damiani in Valenza, Piemonte, on this. It's 3D printed in wax, individually hundreds of parts, then fused together after polishing. The final piece will be about half and half sandblasted matte surface and mirror polished. I think back to my first visit to Vienna when my wife was at a medical conference and spent a lot of time in the Vienna Kunsthistorische Museum, which has this incredible collection of Kunst- und Wunderkammer objects on the ground floor, the most famous of which would be Benvenuto Cellini's salt cellar, almost like state gifts. One visiting monarch would take an example of the greatest his kingdom could produce when he visited another country. It's like, we're going to top you, look what we can do, kind of thing. A showy, super complex objects which were state-of-the-art manifestations of the technology of their country at the time. But on a conceptual level, even though it looks like maybe I'm some kind of crazy historical reenactor, I felt it was a more basic, formal pursuit I was after, in that when I'm working on stone, I try to dematerialize it through translucency, incrustation with elaborate filigree relief, etc., to somehow get beyond that stony surface, but there are limitations to what you can do in stone, and I like the idea of generating a portrait from the core out so that you could view all the way to the core. And then we have one version here, the little dual portrait of me, which was realized in conjunction with Damiani, it's me and Matthew Barney, which is kind of abstract layering, and the next step was to do something with those layers. And I came up with this idea of depicting the history of John Paul II. Now, really crazy project for me, raised as a fundamentalist Christian, to be doing this portrait of a pope. I was commissioned by somebody who has connections to both the Catholic Church and contemporary and modern art, but it's also, I've spent a lot of my time looking at Catholic art. Say that the historical sources of almost every sculpture here comes out of Catholicism. And when I was new in New York, in about 1979, John Paul II came, and I don't know if you remember that time, it's 41 years ago. He was a rock star. He was new and vibrant. He was a playwright. He liked to ski. He rode in the open carriage before the assassination attempt. There was a massive ticker tape parade in New York, one of the largest ever, and it was the first ticker tape parade I ever went to. Happened to be there that day, and he was an admirable guy, it seemed like. Okay, later on, I don't agree with some of his policies, but in general, he fought communism. He was a leader of the Solidarity movement, and so we've got everything down at the bottom. At the back from Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler is embedded in the back, the bad guys that he overcame. You've got the skis. He liked to ski. You got him as an old man and a vibrant middle-aged man. You've got a portrait of Michelangelo Buonarroti, the architect of St. Peter. Me again screaming. You've got the bullet, which will be in solid gold. Was kind of a transformative event in his life. And he survived. He forgave. The Mehmet Ali Aga was the name of the guy who tried to kill him, hired by the Bulgarians, a Turkish guy. Like a complex life of the 20th century. And I tried to put all of that, again, in my attempt in a lot of my work, is to make them almost suffocatingly dense, and to try to push the object to an extreme level. So this one we probably shot a little bit too high, although I think we're eventually going to pull it off here, and hopefully it's done sometime this spring.
And so, because the final work wasn't finished, we made the decision to show the 3D printed model, because it gave us an opportunity to talk about process, to show an artifact of the process, the thing that Damiani Jewelers uses to guide them in checking their creation of the finished product. And also, it's such an extraordinary composition that you can spend hours kind of picking out all of the different little elements that are encrusted, on the exterior, but also in the interior of that sculpture. And I think as I mentioned before, I've been really struggling trying to come up with objects to compare it to, and maybe some of you have an idea that I haven't come across yet, but I've yet to come up with anything. So in the sense that it looks like potentially a very traditional thing, a portrait of a pope, but it's done in a way that as far as I can tell, has never been done before. And it's a pretty extraordinary, ambitious project, and I can't wait to see the final thing.
Me too.
Yeah. Thank you all for hanging with us so long this afternoon. There was a lot to go through. I didn't want to shortchange us. I've been pushing Barry through tours, trying to get through in an hour, and I'm sure we went over that. So thank you for staying with us, and